Welcome back to the Cream City Club podcast. I am Spencer Michaelis, and I'm here once again with Gunnar Amelunk. Gunnar, how are you doing on this Super Bowl Sunday?
Yeah, doing excited or doing good, I guess. I am excited. I said that backwards, but yeah, I mean we reached a milestone on Twitter, 100 followers, so and you'll get into that, but yeah, it's a exciting day. So how you doing?
I'm doing well. Gunnar put out some Patrick Beverly hype on our Twitter, which actually that did pretty well. So uh, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Get you pumped up about Patrick Beverly being an absolute nuisance for the Bucks. Um, but yeah, if you're listening and you haven't yet subscribed, please take a moment to do so on whatever platform you're on. Um, be sure to follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod. I think we're going to be. I know we keep saying this. We're going to keep trying to be a little more active on there and maybe some more videos, some more graphics or something along those lines. But as Gunnar kind of alluded to, we were going to be doing our 100 follower giveaway, and we did reach that milestone last night. So we're gonna have to do the drawing for that here, which we will do. We're just gonna use a random wheel generator, just a random website, and we'll find out who the winner is right now. Okay, looks like it is Kent Ritchie. So, Kent, if you could DM us on Twitter once you hear this. Otherwise, we'll post it on Twitter in a couple days. Um, but congrats to Kent, and
Congrats.
yeah, he'll win the Brewer cards that we put out there for the giveaway. So, congrats, Kent. We'll just need your name, address, and we will get those cards shipped out to you within a few days of having that information from you. So, but without further ado, that's all we got on the contest. Um, we probably will, just for the future, we probably will do a couple more giveaways once we get a little deeper into this and maybe gain a bigger following. But thank you for all of those. I believe we had 17 people who participated in this one. So thank you to all of you. And yeah, Gunnar, what do we got coming up on the pod?
Yeah, let's talk about the podcast now, Spencer. Coming up today, we got to talk about how the Brewers kind of quickly reinvested that salary that we got rid of with Corbin and really went right back into the team. And those guys obviously being Jakob Junis and Gary Sanchez, we can kind of go over what we expect from them, and break them down a little bit for you guys. And obviously looking more towards the future, are there moves that we can still be made? Obviously, we know kind of what our salary is team wise right now, but is there sort of a window still here to add some more guys? We'll look into that. And then next, I mean, we got Brewers dropped a nice video over the last week about the Dominican Republic Academy, and we're gonna just kind of break down why that's important and kind of the cool stuff that they broke down in that. Then of course we got some small minor league moves and camp invites we got to go over, which I know Spencer's probably excited about, even though we probably haven't heard their names. And we got a new sort of ESPN Keith Law prospect update that we got dropped in this last week too that we'll go over. So Spencer, as always, we're going to go over who we acquired first and who are the new Brewers on the roster. Brewers signed first. Of the first two guys that we signed was Jakob Junis, as I mentioned. His salary being a $4 million base salary in 2024. And then in 2025, it's an $8 million mutual option with a $3 million buyout. So technically, he's going to make out worst case $7 million here. So obviously, the report was a little shockingly, not shockingly because of the roster, but the report was that he's going to be brought in as a starter. Shocking because we kind of know his history. He was kind of a mix of what, kind of like a hybrid, you could say. More reliever, but he could definitely make some spot starts. But Spencer, what do you kind of project him as? Maybe even kind of both. Like, do you see him as a starter, even if we're trying to make him a starter, or kind of what do you view him as?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think it's kind of a sign of the Brewers going back towards like the 2018 build of their rotation. Freddie Peralta's probably a notable exception to that. Wade Miley we've seen can go like 6 innings or so, but that 2018 rotation was mostly like a five and dive type rotation. Like you give us 5 innings and then hand it off to the pen. Um, I think as a starter, that's pretty much what Junis should be. If you're hoping for anything out of him as a starter, it's probably a 5, 6 inning max type guy. Sees the order once or probably twice. Probably don't want him seeing it more than twice very often. Um, but for me, I think it's worth trying him as a starter because one, the Brewers are his struggles as a starter mostly came with the Royals, and we actually talked about this when Taylor Clark got when the Taylor Clark trade happened earlier in the offseason, but the Royals pitching development is just awful. So the Brewers, on the other hand, do a pretty good job of maximizing what pitchers can do. Junis is super heavy slider, like 60+% slider. And as a starter, that can always be a little iffy. But if you look back at like the Ulysse Chassin 2018 to keep bringing 2018 up, Chassin was pretty much that type of pitch mix, and then he just used his other pitches as as a way to keep hitters off balance and to keep them off the slider. Um, I wonder. I think the thing is you start Junis as a starter during the season. If it doesn't work out, he should be able to fall back into a relief role where he should be. He's shown to be very successful as a reliever. So worst case scenario, you should get a good reliever. Best case scenario, you should get a pretty solid start, or you could get a pretty solid starter. I think one thing I'm going to be watching for is he started throwing a cutter, I believe the COVID year, didn't throw it much, threw it a little bit more the next year, and then they kind of scrapped it for his sinker, which has always been his primary fastball. The sinker's not very good. It's gotten crushed at the major league level. The reason he started pitching so much better is because his slider usage went up and he stopped seeing hitters as many times. So I'm curious if they try and bring back the cutter. The Brewers are big cutter. They're big fans of cutters. Like they love pitchers who throw cutters. They've done a pretty good job of teaching cutters to people, or at least like expanding upon what they're already doing with their cutter. So I'm curious if they're going to do that with him, because I think if he does that, I could see it more likely to work as a starter if he can find a cutter that works for him, because a one pitch starter is always going to be tough, even though the slider is a really good pitch. It's one of the best sliders in baseball, but as hitters see you more often, it becomes easier to just sit on that one pitch and do something with it. But yeah, I think there's a decent chance he can start. But like I said, I think they'll either need to improve the sinker or bring back the cutter and make some tweaks to that and make it a more feasible first or fastball offering. Because right now I'm not sure he really has one. But yeah, Gunnar, I know you said you were actually almost going to bring him up as an option on the last podcast, and I actually almost did too. So, what were your thoughts on it? I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we were looking at sort of what was available, I guess, at that point, and the obvious need, even at that point, was we have starters, but there's obviously a little bit of a hole there of guys that maybe you trust, and there's just a lot of question marks in the rotation. So naturally, I went over to like who's available right now, and he seemed like the guy who you could probably just get the most out of, I guess, especially just for our money. I mean, we're not getting Blake Snell, obviously. And I think actually the consensus was he was actually one of the better ones left. If not like two or three left. So it seemed like a little bit realistic in the price wise, but I'm just like, nah, someone like he seems like he's kind of valuable, so someone might kind of outbid us there, but we got him and I was excited for that reason. But yeah, I mean, then I kind of looked into him a little bit more, and he doesn't really walk guys that much and stays in the zone. Uh, Creates softer contact, I guess you could say, but nothing like really crazy. I mean, I guess he does. It's just more upper in the league in that, but nothing like crazy. But I guess what concerns me too is he doesn't really get the ball on the ground a ton. So maybe if he's a starter and he's just kind of pushing himself a little bit, I don't know. I mean, you know more of the mechanics of that stuff. I just kind of think of it more in broader terms, but maybe that's kind of a concern, I guess, if his stuff, like you mentioned, his slider, maybe that falls off a little bit as a starter and then ends up kind of being a bad mix there. But I think just looking at our team, and the reason why I kind of circled him as an option was because obviously our starting rotation has a lot of question marks, as I said. So I think you definitely have to try him out there first. And I wonder if that's just more thinking with this, even though we told him like, hey, you're a starter, like you're coming in the season as a starter, but it's more of like we got backup plans sort of thing, and hopefully he works out. But even in a worst case, I mean, he can kind of fill. I don't know if we really had this type of guy last year, but I guess Bryce Wilson is maybe the best comparison just as far as not stuff, but maybe that kind of role. If he can kind of fall into that, if we get guys like Mizorowski or something comes up and Gasser hits and all these younger guys that we think might hit, that could kind of change his role a little bit too. And then obviously, I don't know if we mentioned this last podcast either, and we mentioned it a little bit later today. I'm not sure, but they did tell D.L. Hall that he's going to be a starter. He's coming in as a starter too, so that's just another option that we've gotten. So you look at kind of what we lost, and this is another topic that maybe we'll talk about later, but you look at what we lost. We lost one starter, maybe gained two. So we kind of spread the pie a little bit there, which I think is a good thing. You just kind of hope that at least one of them hits, because then I don't think you really lost much as far as just kind of guys who can fill innings. But if both of them can hit, you're definitely doing pretty well there. So, Spencer, if you got nothing else on Jakob Junis for now, we can slide over to the second signing that we did, which was a little bit more surprising, I would say. This one definitely caught people off guard. Is Gary Sanchez we signed. This isn't official as we're recording, but obviously it seems pretty official. He signed for 1 year, $7 million, and then has another mutual option in 2025. I think the Brewers like doing those types of deals, even though was Wade Miley. I mean, I was thinking we don't really have Wade Miley's a mutual option, but he didn't necessarily pick it up, right?
Yeah, I don't think we've ever had one actually get picked up by
Yeah,
both
that's what
sides.
I mean. It's just, I guess, worst case, you just don't really see those things get picked up, but it's a nice option, I guess. Um, but sort of kind of looking at what he might bring, Spencer, how do you see him fitting into this lineup?
Yeah. Well, first, I will say I think the main reason they do these mutual options are an element. I imagine it's going to be the same with Gary Sanchez as it was with Junis. They like to put that buyout into the mutual option, which basically pushes the money 1 year further down the line. Um, so I think that's a big reason why they
Mhm.
put these in so that they can kind of spread the money out a little bit more. They know it's almost never going to get picked up by both sides. Um, but yeah, in terms of fitting into the lineup, I think one, we we needed a backup catcher that was better than Eric Haas and Austin Nola as the options. Um, Gary has actually he was a really solid defender with the Padres last year. He's shown a lot of signs of being a better defender. Now he can't block to save his life. He's terrible at blocking pitches. He's always been considered super lazy in that regard. That's probably the one concern. I will say, and this is just me guessing, I would bet the Brewers are going to do what they've done with William Contreras, which is to say, you don't block stuff, you pick it. You're going to use your hands instead of trying to even go down and block stuff. Just use your hands and pick the ball. Um, Considering he's very good at framing pitches, I would imagine he's got good hands, which would make that a lot more feasible than him. He's a big, big guy. Gary Sanchez is a big dude. It's not easy to move around behind the plate as a big guy. So telling him, hey, just use your hands, knock it down, get a glove on it, that might actually help him in that regard. So I'm guessing that's kind of the way they're going to go. But otherwise, defensively, he like I said, he receives well. He's got a cannon for an arm, like one of the best arms in baseball. Always has. The main thing, though, is that I think you're going to see him in the lineup every single time the Brewers are facing a left-handed starter, whether that's DHing, whether that's catching. Um, I feel like it just really, really helps that middle of the order. And he's had moments against righties. For his career, he doesn't have like big platoon splits. He did last year, but he's always been able to hit righties pretty decently. So I think he'd be fine to put in the lineup against righties as well. But against lefties, he's really, really hit them well lately. Considering you brought in a guy like Rhys Hoskins already, William Contreras has pretty good stats against lefties as well. That middle of the order against left-handed starters could look a lot better than it did last year when you consider it could be Contreras, Hoskins, and Sanchez just right in the middle of the order. That's a ton of power. Guys who actually do hit lefties really well. I think it really, really helps the power portion of the lineup in general. Like I said, it could be against righties as well, but we've talked about it a couple times, I believe. The Brewers lineup has some decent depth. There's not too many holes in it right now, but if you wanted to add something to this lineup, it felt like it needed power. And Hoskins and Sanchez both bring that to the table in a way that we didn't really have, like pure power hitters, like guys who can just, if they played every day, can hit 30 homers. Um, I wouldn't expect Sanchez to play every day, but I would expect him to get enough at bats where 20 homers is not out of the question. And given it would be in a smaller sample, that would be a really big boost when he is in the lineup. So I love the signing. I think a lot of people were confused about it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, Gunnar, I know you've always been a fan of Gary's swing at the very least, and him as a hitter. So I know you were probably pretty happy to see it happen.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned too, just a quick note before I get into that stuff about how he hasn't really been a full-time player even last year. I mean, he got 260 at bats and he got off to obviously a good start with the Padres and I guess you should say he picked up. I think he started with the Mets, didn't he? And then he got picked up by the Padres or something like that.
Yeah, I think he got
Um,
DFA'd twice. I think the Giants might have had him to start the year or something. It was, yeah.
yeah, because I remember talking about maybe we should pick him up, but obviously we had Victor, so it didn't really make sense. But um, he obviously picked it up after that. But I guess the concerning thing, and like you said, he's not going to play every day. But the last time he did kind of sort of play every day, he didn't do very well those couple of years. So I guess if you can kind of bottle that up a little bit, um, and guys like we talked about, like Jake Bauers or something, like if you can kind of just catch him in good strides and put him in situations to succeed. We mentioned how he kills lefties, at least last year he did. So that's just something that we definitely needed. And looking at sort of his profile, though, too, I know the concerns that you mentioned with maybe people, and this is just kind of Brewers Twitter at this point. I kind of get it, but they kind of see like a low batting average guy, strikes out, whiffs. Um, I just think one we kind of complain about how you mentioned the lack of home run power. Like there's going to be some times of like the yin and the yang. Like there's going to be you got to give a little to get a little sometimes. And like you say, he's not going to play every day. So I mean, if we need some extra pop in that lineup, we can just easily plug him in. And I think people just kind of need to get over the batting average and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter. But that's just I guess the one concerning thing. But he's going to be in positions to succeed, like I said. But yeah, I mean, one of his swing over the years I've definitely enjoyed, and he does kind of have a little bit of a lazier kind of feel to him, but I think it's just more of a relaxed type of feel, especially hitting and stuff. So, and you mentioned kind of how that's kind of him like blocking and stuff. That's kind of the complaint. I kind of see that soon, like on the offensive side of that. At least the couple of years before last when he kind of was struggling, I can kind of totally see that vibe with him. But I think the question I had for you, and you mentioned how he's always going to be in the lineup versus lefties. You kind of look at our lineup. Let's say he does get like some DHing opportunities, which when this first broke, I'm like, oh wait, we actually could have this as like a DH option. But then also he's a catcher, so you don't really carry three catchers in the roster. Do you kind of see that as sort of a not a problem, but do you even see that kind of as an option? Can he even be a DH necessarily if you don't have like a backup catcher then at that point? Obviously, for people who don't know, you can make it work. Like let's say William got hurt in a game, you just lose the DH at that point,
Yeah,
but it kind of ruins your flexibility a little bit. Do you kind of still see him as a DH option?
I do. So originally, like a few years ago, I always wondered, like, could you make a catcher really work? But like you said, all you'd have to do is figure it out for one game if something happens like that. So Contreras gets hurt, you got to figure it out for one game. What you're going to do um, with Sanchez, who's going to obviously move behind the plate, you're going to have to treat it like an old National League game, basically, is what it would come down to. Like pitchers either hit or get pinch hit for. But I think you can make it work. I think even just looking at last year's team, when Caratini would catch, there was still a decent amount of time that Contreras would spend at DH. I don't think it's as difficult as I once believed. Now, you could get, like I said, you could get put in a bad situation for one game. That would suck. But I also don't think that's worth saying, okay, we're not going to put a good bat in the lineup just because we're worried we might get put in like a tough position for 6 innings or something. Like that's not worth that concern. Um, and I think just the ability to put someone, like I said, that middle of the order looks, a lefty pitcher does not want to face that middle of the order. In the past, they were just fine facing our middle of the order. Contreras was like the one guy who hit lefties pretty well. And even then last year, I don't think he was incredible against them. I think it was more even than it had been like with the Braves. But otherwise, I mean, Mike Brosseau was a guy we brought in to be a lefty hitter. Like that was, we couldn't hit lefties for power hardly at all. Willie has reverse splits for his career, so he doesn't really hit lefties that well. I think it was really big to add some people in the middle of this order. And I had somebody point this out to me, but so last year, the Brewers DH spot combined for 14 home runs in 663 plate appearances, which is, I would imagine that was, if not the worst in baseball, it was very close. Last year, if you just take Jake Bauers at bats against right-handed pitchers and Sanchez against left-handed pitchers, they hit 21 home runs in 323 plate appearances. So they hit 7 more home runs in under half the plate appearances as what our DH role gave us last year. That's why I think if you can balance this out correctly and get Bauers against righties, get Sanchez against lefties, obviously they're both going to spend some time at first and at catcher and stuff, but I think that DH spot could be in a much, much better spot. And I mean, Bowers will place him first while Hoskins DHs, whatever. You're going to maneuver it around, but unless Bowers has a really bad spring, I expect him to make the team, and I expect him to get a lot of at-bats against righties. He really did do well against them last year, and he did even better if you look at like expected stats and the StatCast batted ball data. Like he hit the ball really hard, and Sanchez kind of does that against lefties. So I think they could have a really nice platoon at the DH spot between first catcher and DH, kind of just all rotating in and out. So yeah, I don't know exactly. That's how I would do it. I don't know how Pat Murphy plans to do it or how the Brewers plan to do it, but that's how I see it working. And I really do think it could work pretty well. But yeah, Gunnar, we kind of already, like I touched on quickly, we were at the point where we were pretty much assuming that Eric Haas was our backup. And Austin Nola was probably the guy waiting in the wings if Haas didn't work out, and then maybe Jefferson Cairo comes after them. So I guess in the question some people had, and I saw foul territory people asking this, AJ Pierzynski, Todd Frazier, they were kind of wondering like why bringing in another, and what will happen with the other two? Like what situation might they end up in now that they came in because they thought they had a pretty decent chance to compete for that backup spot. And now it looks like, barring an injury, that neither of them are making the team. So what happens to them now?
Well, I'll let you break down sort of the contract part of it, of why that part kind of makes sense, but player wise, there really isn't a question here why that's the case. I mean, Sanchez is a lot better than both of those guys. I mean, like I said a couple podcasts ago, again, I'm always referencing back to our old podcast, but we were kind of joking of how like we can argue about these two guys, but they both aren't going to project super well for this year anyways. We felt maybe like Nola was more of the safer option, and maybe Hase was sort of like the higher ceiling, I guess, of those two, offensively at least. But yeah, like I said, I just think Sanchez is really not even a question in my mind why you'd bring in another replacement for them. What will happen to the other two? I think there's no way that they didn't really know that maybe there's going to be an option of us bringing in somebody else. I mean, they didn't have like 100% major league deals. And like I said, I'll let you break down the contract part of it, but they also know they're coming off of not great seasons. They didn't have this huge market to where like, okay, we're getting like, you're the backup guy and you're going to compete to get a lot of starts, like something like that. I mean, they knew what their position was going to be. Um, and I guess maybe just looking at it through their eyes, like, yeah, there was an opportunity there to get the backup catcher spot. Granted, that closed pretty quickly here, but like like I mentioned, their market, like look around the league, like they probably just felt like this is my best chance. Maybe there is still a chance. Like we mentioned, he can be a DH, and maybe one of them sticks in AAA or whatever, and we re-sign them if, based on their contract, blah blah blah. But there's still maybe an option there for them, and they can get a chance to maybe we can use it. They have a good spring, and we can trade one of them or something like that. Like there's still going to be an opportunity here to showcase what they've got. But yeah, speaking about that contract, Spencer, kind of why does, for people, I guess, who don't know, why does it make sense to do this for us? And maybe some people thought that they're kind of locked into the Brewers roster, at least one of them. How do we kind of escape getting rid of these guys?
Yeah, so Nola's contract was a minor league contract. I'm sure there's some sort of bonus if he makes the major league roster or something, but it wasn't like a split contract, which is what Haas signed, where he was, if he made the major league roster, I believe it was something over a little over $1 million, and if he's in the minors, he gets 750,000. So he got that split contract, put him on the 40 man, which does put him in a spot where he's probably the first guy up if something does happen to a catcher. But like you said, I think there's a decent chance that, say they have one of them has a pretty solid spring. There's always teams looking for a cheap backup catcher at the end of spring, especially one that I believe if we traded Haas, he'd still be able to go down to the minors for that team because he signed a split contract. And then Nola obviously would be able to as well, but Nola will have a bunch of opt-outs, and one of them will probably even be at the end of spring training. So decent chance he just ends up back on the market and signs with somebody where he thinks he has a better chance of making the roster at some point. But yeah, for Haas, I wouldn't be shocked, like you said, if we did see a trade at the end of spring for somebody. I think back a couple years ago, Brewers signed Pedro Severino, and they also signed Brett Sullivan as backup catcher options. Severino gets suspended before the season actually starts. And then Brett Sullivan was sitting there And a lot of people, it was looking like until the last couple days of spring that he was going to be the backup. And then the Brewers decided to trade him along with, I want to say Corey Howell was the other guy who went in the trade for Victor Caratini. And they got Caratini as the backup. He was their guy. They also traded Hayden Cantrell and Alex Ramirez, I want to say, for what's his name? Guy we traded to the Rays after Alex Jackson. They got Alex Jackson from the Marlins as like their third catcher option. But to me, like these types of deals, it's weird because you sign a guy and you expect them to be in the organization, but there is precedent for the Brewers trading players that they just signed to like a minor league deal or a split contract of some sort. So it wouldn't shock me, especially if Haas like asks for it and says, "Hey, I thought I was gonna have a chance at this backup spot. I don't really want to go to Nashville. If I have to, I will, but if we can find a deal that makes sense for us, how about we do that?" Like, I think that happens more than people think. It sounds weird for a guy in that position to be asking for a trade, but I think it's more of a, if we can, let's do it. See if we can find something that works for both of us. That wouldn't shock me for him. But the big thing is now that is your depth, and that's not bad depth to have. It was just not a good backup catcher to have. So my guess would be that Nola opts out in spring unless he has a much, much better spring than Haas does. And the Brewers like maybe even add him to the 40-man and put him in their AAA spot or something and then trade Haas, whatever. But I would imagine that Haas is the third string guy. He sits in Nashville waiting for an opportunity. I don't know if we needed a third catcher last year at any point, but that's rare. I'm pretty sure we made it through the whole season without calling up another catcher, and that doesn't happen. So at some point he would most likely get a chance. So that's kind of how I view it coming together.
Let me challenge your brain here for a second because I just got probably a question that people are thinking about. Let's say that both of these guys do get like they're gone. That we trade Haas and then Nola picks somebody else. Who is going to be? You mentioned that third guy. Who is that third guy? Maybe sitting in the minors right now because we mentioned a couple podcasts ago all the backup catchers that or quote backup catchers, depth catchers that we signed in the minors. Which one of those guys do you think would have to step up in that situation?
I think the next guy in line would probably be Brian Neveretto. He's the best defender of the whole group. He's hit okay in AAA. He's not a great hitter, but really, really good defender. Really good arm, kind of run or can handle a pitching staff as well as anybody that I've seen down there. So I've liked Navarretto for a while, actually. If we hadn't brought anybody in, I thought I went into spring or into the winter kind of thinking he might get that backup spot. When we were at when we were at those Diamondbacks wild card games, I was the weird guy who noticed that he was warming up pitchers, which meant that he had been brought on as like the what are they called? Like the traveling team that they have the they're allowed to have like three players they bring with in case something happens that they can just add to the roster right away. So I noticed that he was warming up pitchers, which meant he was probably part of that group, and that made me think that he's probably the guy they trust the most out of all the guys down there currently. So I would imagine it'd be the same thing. He'd probably be next in line, and I think he'd be fine. He'd be able to just hold his own as a defensive guy and maybe hit for a little extra base pop or something. He's not a great hitter, but yeah, he would be next in line for me. But yeah, like I kind of touched on earlier with the foul territory guys, I was watching and listening to them a little bit this week because they had a bunch of Brewer guys on for interviews. But after the Quentin Berry interview they spent like 5 minutes just completely confused by what the Brewers are doing this offseason. Like nobody could understand. Eric Kratz was the only one who was kind of saying like some stuff that actually made sense. But Todd Frazier and AJ Pierzynski and Scott Braun were all kind of just like, I don't get why the Brewers went out and made these pickups that they liked. They liked the Hoskins pickup, the Gary Sanchez pickup, the Jakob Junis pickup. They liked bringing Miley back. Like they liked all of that. And then they're really confused why they did all of those things while also trading Burnes. And I think there's a definite section of the Brewer fan base that's in that same spot where they're just like, well, why did we make all these moves that really do look like they're going to make us better this year and then turn around and trade Burnes? And I know we've talked about it on here, but let's say somebody who is just very clearly confused by it wants you to explain the reasoning behind it. Like, how would you lay it out for that person why the Brewers would go this direction?
For me, I think this is a lot bigger than just a payroll talk. I think people obviously point to our payroll and they say, well, we got rid of $15 million. Now all we're doing is replacing it. Like we were kind of in a situation before where we could have still signed guys. Like it was still pretty low. I think that's kind of the wrong way to look at it, and that's definitely an option. We're going to talk about maybe guys that we can still pick up because of that payroll, but you got to look at sort of the bigger aspect to that. And I kind of view it as sort of like a tree. Like we really expanded on the talent tree just from Corbin Burnes alone. Um, People don't like talking about. I kind of joked with you. You sent me a text, and this is kind of your point, so I'm sure you're going to bring it up. So I'll announce it. I'm stealing it. But I mentioned kind of that tree that I was talking about of like talent that we just got. So if you look at kind of like, think of it like who we traded for Corbin Burnes, and you add in guys like Jakob Junis and Gary Sanchez to Hall Ortiz in the pick, we just got potentially five people for this year that can help us for one guy. Now, to me, as long as all those guys are guys that we believe in and are talented and we think that can help the roster, you didn't get completely fleeced in a trade somehow. I think that's definitely a positive, and I just think this is even if I think of it like this too, even if I was like the GM of the Cubs or the Yankees, I think of all these big markets that people like try to bash us because we're not them. I still think even if I was the GM of one of those teams, the Mets now because we have David Stearns there, um, I think even if you watch sort of like maybe his moves going forward, I think they all kind of want to run like this, even though yes, they have more of a leeway to go and sign the big name out there in the free agent market. They're all still trying to run their team just like how we're trying to run the team. At least in my opinion, if you're smart, that's how you'd run the team. So yeah, I think if I was even in that situation personally, this is how I'd be running my franchise. And maybe if people would be like, yeah, in an ideal world, you'd want to keep Corbin Burnes, maybe. But I also think specifically with Corbin Burnes, as I mentioned, probably five times at least, he was on, to our opinion, on like a downward sort of track. He's a pitcher. He's turning, I don't know what age he is. He's got to be closing in on 30. Um, those are kind of signs to me of guys that maybe aren't the smartest to keep around for a huge salary for a bunch of years. And if I can spread that pie with maybe younger guys, not even younger guys, just guys who can help me right now, plus younger guys um, who are talented and can spread that sort of window out. Um, I think that's a positive for us. So, Spencer, I know I'm probably touching a lot of those points for you, but if you want to expand on any of those, or if you got a new kind of angle on that, what do you got?
Yeah, so you definitely hit it right on the head. For me, this is, and I tweeted this out, but I understand that fans don't love when the Brewers do stuff like this, and you can go back to the hater trade for it. I mean, the phrase I would use is it's counter building. It's at the same time that you're trying to compete, you're also building for the future, and it's something that the Rays are good at. And I know people, to me, I don't understand this, but some people really don't like being compared to the Rays because like they're cheap. They do all this, and like yes, that they are cheap, and they're much cheaper than the Brewers. Um, they've had pretty sustained success right now, and no, they have not won a World Series. How many teams have won a World Series? It's not that easy to win a World Series. And you look at across the league, there are different ways of getting there, but there are no ways of guaranteeing you a World Series. You look at the Mets and the Padres last year. In this time of year, last year, find me someone who expected both of them to be sitting at home when the playoffs started. Nobody. There was nobody who said that. Find me somebody who has thought that the Dodgers were just going to win every World Series the last 5 years because they had the payroll. The only one they've won is the COVID one. It's the only one. The one that really was a shortened season. It was a much different circumstance. It's hard to win the World Series. And to me, the Brewers, by doing what they're doing here, I could make the argument that the Brewers are better than they were before the Burnes trade right now. It's close. I don't know that I could 100% believe in it myself, but I could make the argument for it. Here's how you kind of have to look at it. Are Ortiz, Hall, Junis, and Sanchez, are they better than not just Burnes, but are they better than Burnes and whoever they are replacing? So Sanchez absolutely better than Haas. Is Ortiz better than like Monasterio or Terang, whoever he might be replacing in the lineup? I'm guessing he's going to be, yes. Is Hall or Junis better than Corbin Burnes? No, they're not. But could they be 85% of what Corbin Burnes has been in terms of production? Yes, I think they could be. And then the other one's replacing some other fifth or sixth starter or some end of the pen guy who they could absolutely be a lot better than. To me, that roster is better than it was beforehand. Now, like Gunnar said, you can make the argument that they could have kept Burnes and then still gone out and got Junis and Sanchez, and they could have. They could have. But I don't think they were going to. And there is a budget, whether people want to hear it or not, there's a budget. And you can get mad at Arnold for all these things, but Arnold's not the one setting this budget. He's the one who follows the budget and does what he can with it. And when he is given a budget, which to me is a reasonable budget, it's not as high as I think Mark could go, but I think it's pretty reasonable for what the market size is and what Mark is capable of as an owner. He's not even close to amongst the top of the line, like net worth wise. Most of his net worth is in the Brewers. So most of his money comes from selling the Brewers. The thing is, the Brewers, like I said, I think this is an improvement over what they had in terms of their roster. And at the very least, it's like a net neutral. And they did this while gaining 6 years of control for Hall, 6 years of control for Ortiz, who I think in the future could be a lot better than I expect them to be this year. And then they reinvested the money from Burnes immediately into two guys who are going to help this year's team too. And that's how the Brewers have to operate, in my opinion, and that's how they should operate, in my opinion. I know people hate bites at the apple. I get it. It was not phrased well by Stearns. He made it sound a lot different than what he intended. I think the way Arnold describes what they're trying to do is probably a lot easier for a lot of fans to like understand where he's coming from. As good as David Stearns is as a GM slash president of baseball operations, he's not good at public speaking or public just like talking to normal people. He's not good at it. It's an uncomfortable listen most of the time. It always has been. He doesn't phrase things very well for people who are just trying to kind of get an understanding of what's going on. He phrases it fine for people who really nerd out about this stuff, but Arnold does a better job, I think, of relating to what the public actually understands. And if you listen to how he talked about it, it's basically that. It's the Brewers have to walk this line of staying competitive, but also not hurting themselves for the future. And to me, Corbin Burnes is not some complete game changer for the Brewers. He's just not. He's a very good pitcher. He pitches every 5 days. He's been a mediocre to okay playoff pitcher. I don't think he changes the entire scope of the season for the Brewers. So why not add to a team that's going to be competing for years while also still being competitive this year? And like you said, I think we'll jump into it in a second here, but I don't know that they're done. This doesn't mean they're done still either. In fact, I probably feel more confident that they're not done than I did before these two signings, because it does seem like they really are going full on like counter build mode here. This is what the Rays would have done in this situation. They did it with Glasnow. If you look at, they traded Glasnow because they know they're not re-signing him this offseason. They got guys that are going to help them this year and in the future. Honestly, Jakob Junis felt like a Rays signing all offseason. I kind of expected him to be ending up with the Rays. So I know people don't want us to be the Rays, and I don't want us to be the Rays either, because I think the Brewers have a bigger budget and are more capable of spending more money than the Rays. But operating like the Rays, that's what the Dodgers do. People don't want to hear that, but that's what the Dodgers do. They got their GM or whatever Friedman is from the Rays, and they took it and they made themselves a great farm system that they keep replenishing. They just have more resources to work with on the other end of things. So they put big money into some big free agent signings. But honestly, I found this out just the other day. Like, if you take Shohei and Yamamoto out of it, the Dodgers don't have that many huge contracts over the course of their time. Like, they extended Mookie. The Freddie Freeman deal was pretty big. But you got to go back to like Adrian Gonzalez type deals. Like, they don't have that many huge contracts. They just do a really good job of consistently building up their farm, consistently building bullpens like the Brewers do. Their bullpens are never expensive. They're a bunch of guys that they find kind of laying around, and then they have usually like a really good closer on top of it that they've paid for. In a lot of ways, the Brewers operate like the best teams in baseball. They just don't necessarily have the money that they can make those extra moves for. That doesn't mean they can't win, though. And do I think this team's winning the World Series this year? No. I don't think I'll ever go into a season expecting the Brewers to win the World Series. Frankly, I don't think any fan of any baseball team in MLB should think that their team's going to win the World Series and view that season as a failure if they don't, because that's just not how baseball works. It's not how it's meant to be consumed. It's not how it's meant to be watched. And I get the frustration from people on this, and I get some of the confusion from the national media on this. But you just keep giving yourself these chances, and at some point, you hope it works out. And I've ranted for a while here, but I do want to say one more thing. I think the Brewers could take bigger bites at the apple, to use the Stearns expression, than they do. But I also don't think you do it completely to sacrifice your future. And we talked about it when we did our big like off-season trade thing with the Greinke trade and those types of deals. Like trades like that can set you back, and they have set the Brewers back in the past. There's a lot of risk to doing things like that. And just to give yourself that slightly better chance at a World Series that frankly, I don't really know that it is that much better when you get into the playoffs and you're just playing 3 to 5 to 7 to game series. I just think anybody can beat anybody in that type of setting. And it takes luck, it takes health, it takes a lot of things to win a World Series. But to me, just keep getting in the playoffs and you're going to have a shot. And yeah, I'm sure that I've talked way too long now, but Gunnar,
I got one more point, and it's kind of building off of what you said, and sort of a little bit of what I was alluding to of how I think every team kind of wants to run like this, and I think the Dodgers did a good job of exploiting their powers maybe this last off season. And I think that's just kind of where you have to look at it, like where do they have the real advantage to like beat out the smaller markets? Like I guess like a Trevor Bauer deal with the Dodgers or something like that, where they can just like really just throw their pocketbook at you and say, I'm just going to outbid you now. Like that's my power over you. But think about like every single MLB season that we have, there's always a big name available for a trade. I mean, you look back even to like 2018, our best season, like Manny Machado, I always talk about how we could have got him. Like, and that's not to say like that's not even my point. It's just that go over all these years, why are big names always available? It's because everybody's trying to build just like we're trying to build. They're trying to get prospects back for guys that maybe are they can maybe spend and then maybe they can actually keep them. But the odds of them actually producing, and then you can also build the tree out like I was talking about. I just think people always try to grow the tree, I guess is the best way to put it. But like even last year, we look at like the Angels. They're Los Angeles. They should have this big pocketbook. They got Mike Trout. People were screaming at them that they should trade Shohei Ohtani. Why is that the case? He's amazing. He's the best player in baseball. Why should they trade him? Well, it's because the roster isn't that very good, and they don't do good at drafting. Most of the time, they got some good prospects now, but it's a way for them to kind of expand their tree. I think the Dodgers don't have to do that, as you mentioned. Kind of, I just went around in a full circle here, but as I mentioned, is they do everything well, like with their organization. So they have so much power in the sense that they got backup prospects that they don't even really need. They can go out and get the Mookie Betts. That's from Boston. Boston should be able to sign Mookie Betts, right? Because they're Boston. They felt like they don't have a great system, so that's why that trade sucked because the players they got back weren't amazing. Verdugo's okay, but like anybody else, it wasn't worth Mookie Betts. But everybody's trying to do the same thing we're trying to do. It's just on a slightly bigger scale, and they have a little bit more leeway. But that's just how a good franchise gets run. So I think the Dodgers are just like in a way, it's a good outlier. That's the best organization for a reason. But just every single other team is doing what we're doing, but they have a little bit higher leeway to sign guys. Otherwise, they're trying to do the same thing we're doing, and we have a good farm system. We just can't sign the huge free agents. But yeah, I guess that's my little rant there too.
Yeah. Well, and even on top of that, like Brewers did just extend Chariot. The Brewers have extended Yelich. Now, you can argue that the Yelich deal is not worth it and it's not going to be worth it. But I keep seeing this idea that the Brewers keep losing these players that they brought up and developed. Beyond Burnes that they traded, obviously, they've lost CC, who they did not bring up or develop. They brought him in for half a season. Greinke, who they traded after a year and a half. And I got nothing else. I mean, Woodruff is an injury, so he's gone. But like, who else have the Brewers lost that they developed and like couldn't pay? Like they paid Braun. They extended Lucroy through his prime. They extended Gomez through his prime. They traded all these guys at the right time. It's very weird to me that it's almost like we have this idea as a fan base that, well, we're a small market and we play into that by saying like, we never bring any of our guys. Like we brought all our guys, but all the guys that we've had that we've loved, this is like one of the first people to actually leave. And you can go back and talk about Paul Molitor and whatever, like in my lifetime, this is the first guy who truly we are trading in like the middle of his career because we can't afford to pay him. And I have no problem with that. I think that's going to happen. We've seen it, like Gunnar just said, with Mookie Betts and the Red Sox, who everyone views as a team that can pay people and has the money and the budget to do stuff, and they couldn't afford to keep him, and they didn't want to pay him to keep him. And it does happen all around the league. I think the Brewers are one of the best in baseball at this thing, if not the best at counter building. Now that they have a guy who might be able to explain it in Arnold better than Stearns, I don't know that they'll get as much heat for it like they did for the Hader trade. I kind of have the feeling that if Arnold had been running things during the Hader trade and still went that route, that the team might have taken it better, because I think Arnold would have done a better job of explaining what the logic was and why we were doing it and how we still expected the team to win and all this stuff. But yeah, okay, we got to move on. I've talked way too much about this. But so I guess kind of taking a look at the roster, I was just kind of doing like a rough sketch of a 26-man roster over this week. And for me, it's getting tight. Like it's getting really tight, especially on the pitching side of things. So are there any other areas you think they might look to add, or do you think there's somewhere they might make another trade to like subtract from, including the not yet official Sanchez signing? Do you think the entire 26-man roster is already in the organization? Like the guys that we are going to go into the season with are already signed in the organization, and this is pretty much what we're working with?
I personally think we're probably set unless something like really crazy, like we sign somebody or a good trade comes up. I guess I'm just more scared of, I wouldn't really sell low on any of our outfielders, quote unquote low, I guess, in our opinion. Um, in my opinion, at least. I don't know, maybe you have a different opinion on certain players in that group, but just because it's a log jam, yes, as far as playing time, but in our shoes, maybe selfishly as an organization, it's not really a logjam. Like we can make it work. We can find out who's the guy that we want to stick around, who's the guy we want to build with. I think if that trade does come up, like I've mentioned this trade, like a Garrett Mitchell, and we can get a guy with maybe not as high of a ceiling, but a guy who can help us at a different spot. Um, Third base, a starter, I don't know. I think that would make some sense, but I also don't think we need to force anything at this point. I think this roster is good enough as it is. But yeah, I mean, I can go over the free agents again. I'm not sure there's really one that I'm really going to try to break open the bank for. We mentioned the Matt Chapman one that still hasn't happened. Um, Something like that, maybe I could maybe still see something that really pushes the needle. Otherwise, it's just like, why do it at this point? Like, just we can compete, we can find out what we got going on, um, and then we can kind of just move forward. But I know Spencer, you had one that you were very doing the process that you were doing. I think you noticed something that you wanted to talk about. So, what did you notice?
Yeah. So the bullpen to me is going to be very, very hard to figure out when we get to this, when we get to the end of spring. So obviously, there's a pretty good chance we see some injuries over the course of spring. It usually happens. Somebody goes on the IL, which makes it a little easier to figure out what you have. But the Brewers only have, in their entire pitching staff, 7 optionable pitchers. I shouldn't say that, but they have 7 optionable pitchers that you would pretty much not consider optioning. That would be Freddie Peralta. I don't even think you could now without him. I think he'd have the right to refuse the option, so you couldn't really send him down, and you wouldn't want to. DL Hall, which I would be pretty surprised if they send him down, because I think they want him to impact the team in one way or another, either starting or relieving. Aaron Ashby, who is making major league money now because of his extension, I don't think they're going to want to send him down unless things just aren't going well in his rehab. Devin Williams, not getting sent down. Abner Uribe, I highly doubt he's getting sent down unless control issues just completely go crazy in spring. Hobie Milner, I believe, still has an option, and he is not getting sent down. And then Trevor McGill, who I could see him in the right situation being sent down if they really want to keep somebody. We saw a lot of really good things from him at the end of the year, but I don't know. I mean, it would be a hard one to send down. But then you talk about the non-optionable guys in the bullpen. Piamps, who was not getting sent down either way. But then you have Bryce Wilson. You have JB Bukowskis, who I like a lot, and I really am hoping they can find a way to keep him on the roster. Thiago Vieira, who I actually think he's super interesting, but he's probably the guy that's they're most willing to just let go of if they have to. And then Joe Ross, who they signed this offseason to a legitimate like $1.75 million deal. So I can't imagine he's not going to at least make the roster to start the year. And then you have all these guys in AAA who do have options like Taylor Clark, Brian Hudson, Elvis Peguero, even Jansen Junk, all these guys who are on the 40-man and all are interesting arms. I'm just, it kind of seems like there's a trade coming from that group to me. Um, it's going to be really hard to squeeze in all the arms they like. And it might be a small, I mean, it could just be Vieira gets you cash in a trade or Bukauskas moves for something like that too. Um, but I look at a guy like Bryce Wilson, who I'm not sure I trust to repeat what he did last year. Like, I think he's got a chance to be solid again, but if a team is interested in him enough to give us like a lottery ticket type prospect for him, I would make that trade pretty quickly and just move forward with, even if it is a Jansen Junk as your long man or something like that. Joe Ross could probably fill that role, honestly. Um, I just feel like we're probably going to see some movement in the bullpen in terms of, I would think, a trade. But you never know. It could just be that Vieira's got no value to anybody, and we just release him at the end of spring. Same with Bukauskas. But those are two guys that I find super interesting, especially I think Bukauskas could pitch in the Brewers bullpen, and I was happy that we were able to keep him through the offseason. So that, I mean, that's the one I keep looking at. If there's going to be a move, like you said, I think one of the outfielders for a young starter is still always going to be on the table if the right trade comes around. Um,
Mhm.
or same thing for like another young infielder that we like more than Terang or them or whatever, then sure, like those types of moves will always be out there. But if I'm anticipating any sort of actual move, I would imagine it would be coming from the bullpen group and see what happens there.
I
But
keep
yeah,
forgetting to mention this guy too, and not to cut you off, I guess, but and I think what you're mentioning too, I think that's not necessarily like a thing you have to figure out again this in the next couple weeks. That
yep,
can be played out all the way through spring, and that could be
yeah,
like literally the last second trade you make right before the season starts. So I guess if maybe one of these podcasts we can kind of go through once we have the results of spring training, you can kind of start to rank them. Um, but one guy I forgot to mention too, I mentioned kind of the free agency, and this is. I feel like this whole season has kind of worked, or a whole off season has kind of worked out perfectly for this situation. And this isn't a new thought, but we think about like our team salary right now, the fact that this guy still hasn't been signed, Big Woo, Brandon Woodruff. I think this situation literally has played out perfectly to bring him back. Do I think it's likely still? Probably not. But I just mentioned how there's really nobody out there that you're kind of willing to spend to, spend that money on. But a guy that one amazing clubhouse guy. No, he's not going to help us on the field this year. But if you can sign him to like we assume 2 years, but let's say 2, 3 years or whatever, because his value isn't really as great as he thought it was. But I just think that makes a ton of sense right now. Even looking forward, whatever we mentioned this again before, but even next year, let's say we sign Willie Adames, like our contracts are still going to be fine, even if we had Brandon Woodruff. At that point, it'd be 1 year or 2 years, like it's perfect. So I just think that situation sort of has played out perfectly. And as the days pass, I kind of get my hopes up more and more and more that it might happen. But I just think it's just such a perfect scenario now to bring him back, and I would love to see him back. So yeah, I don't know if you had I know that was actually kind of your original thought. I think you
yep,
opened that door for me because I didn't even really consider that. But now I'm like thinking over like this whole offseason. I'm like, oh my God, there's a chance here. So
yeah. No, I completely forgot about that. I did bring that up at one point, but I think it would make sense. I mean, like you said, I think there'd be a ton of value to having him around the team. Like even you think about when Stephen Vogt's shoulder was all screwed up and he couldn't play, but like everyone talked about how he's basically another coach and just a great guy to have around the team that whole time he was hurt. And thinking back to like when Suter had Tommy John, like he was there that whole time around the team, just being a great person to have around. And then you get the upside of Woodruff potentially being himself in year two. And now I would put the odds of that at pretty low, but I also think the odds of him being an okay pitcher after he comes back are decent. Um, and a guy who competes like him and just has that mentality usually will find a way to just be at least okay throughout whatever, no matter what his stuff is at the time. Um, he would make a ton of sense. I will say, I think if we see that, it's going to happen once spring starts, because once we get into spring training, I believe you can start putting players on the 60-man IL and opening up 40-man spots by doing so. So if they put him, they could sign him and immediately 60-day IL him without having to use a 40-man spot on him. Um, and I believe at that time there's a possibility the Brewers will have a couple other guys that they might need to put on that type of thing to open up a 60-day spot too. So, or open up a 40-man spot. So yeah, I did forget about that. I do think he would make sense. And it would definitely make me happy. We talked about it on the one podcast pretty early on, how much Woodruff kind of has, how big of a fan both of us are of Woodruff as not just the player, but like the person and how easy he is to root for, and kind of the opposite of what we talked about with the Burnes podcast last time. Just he seems like a guy that you really, really want to have on your team and you really want to be around. And even over the years, like I've texted you stuff and been like, I think, and I think I've tweeted it too, but like, I don't think there's any Brewer in my lifetime where I felt like, oh my God, I want to be teammates with that guy more than Brandon Woodruff. Like he just always seemed like the guy that you would want to be like, go to battle with, the guy who just has this great attitude, who loves everybody, who has no issues with anyone, like the type of guy you really want to be around. So any way they could get him back into the organization the next couple of years would be just fine by me. And like you said, the money should be out there and reasonable, I would think at this point. So yeah, now I'm definitely getting my hopes up for that. So thank you for that, because now I got something to look forward to. But yeah, you got anything else? I mean, on additions or subtractions or anything along those lines? Okay. We can jump in then to the new Dominican Academy that the Brewers posted that video of. If you haven't seen it, it was originally unlisted on their YouTube account. You had to get it through the tweet, so I don't know if it's on their YouTube account right now or not.
I think it is.
Okay, so yeah, you should be able to check it out. It's like 11 minutes, really good watch. But the main takeaways for me were, one, it is just an incredible facility. Like it's gorgeous. It's got at least four really nice fields, huge weight room, like state of the art weight room. But the big thing I kept noticing is how much they were emphasizing education and kind of preparing these guys for baseball, and they want all these guys to work out, and they want as many to work out as they can as baseball players, but they understand that they just signed 35 people in this last class, which was way more than any other franchise. They know that they're kind of playing the odds of like, okay, we signed 35, we might get 3 out of this group that are real baseball players that we view as prospects that are going to help us at one point. You might get a Jackson Churio, you might get a Jefferson Caro, you might get a Gilbert Lara, who was a huge signing and then didn't do anything. So they kept talking about how important it is for these kids who, with the way the international scene works, these kids have been out of school since they were like 10. They have not gone to school. They have been straight training for baseball in a lot of these cases since they were like 10 years old. A lot of them who flame out then don't really know how to live a normal life because everything's been baseball for the last 6 years, and they didn't go to school. They don't really have the education. They don't really know how to interact with people in like a normal setting. And they talked about so much of how important that is for them to teach them. Like, one, they want to teach them as much English as they can so that they can understand how life works when they do come over to the Arizona League and then potentially full season ball and stuff. But they just wanted to teach them life skills they kept talking about. And I did think that was cool. I don't think the Brewers are that special in that regard. I think a lot of teams have realized the importance of that, but it was nice to see them focus on it during it. I think it's super important. These are high school age kids who haven't gone to school for 5 years in a lot of cases. Like, they need these types of lessons to be able to function as decent people in the world. Like they don't know any better otherwise. But I also like they focus so much on like, we make sure they have good food, good, just good living quarters, all this stuff. Like, to me, the best way for players to get better is to be able to focus solely on baseball and education and not have to worry about all the other outside stuff, not worry about where am I getting my next meal? Do I need to make some extra money to pay rent this month? Because some of these guys, yes, some of these guys got $1 million signing bonuses. Some of them got $10,000 signing bonuses. That's not helping them live for it, and they're not getting paid much while they're in the minors, which we know, and that's improved a little bit, but it's still not in a good place. Allowing them to just focus solely on baseball and education, not have to worry about all that other stuff, to me, that's how you're going to get the best out of them as players. And I've actually always wondered why teams don't just do that at every level. Like, to me, like, obviously you don't need to build a full facility for guys who are 22 years old playing in high A. But to me, if you provide them all with all their meals, they have living, they don't have to worry about where they're going to live. They don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And you pay them enough to live on. I just think that's how you're going to get the best out of players. And it's an advantage that you would hold over other teams who don't do it. So it's nice to see that happening there. I think one thing I wanted to point out based on seeing that, and something I talked about a couple weeks ago, was I think people really overlook the amount of everyone sees the dollars and cents when it comes to the payroll and when it comes to stuff like that, and not paying Craig Counsell the largest managerial sum in MLB history. Like everyone notices that and sees that. I think a lot of fans overlook how much of the investment goes towards other stuff in the franchise. And the Dominican Academy is a great example of that. That was not a cheap expenditure. Like this was a very expensive thing that came out of the Brewers owners' pockets. There was no help from other people. I mean, maybe the Dominican pitched in a little bit. I don't know for sure, but it was largely the Brewers' expense, and they had to deal with it and put it out there. And they put it into these kids to help them grow, but also because it helps their player development, which helps their team down the line. And they did the same thing with the Arizona complex, which went from one of the worst places in Arizona to arguably the best. So the Arizona complex league is much better when people are there for spring training. It's a lot better for them. And it just helps them be better players. And then it got me thinking kind of along the lines of, I don't know if anybody has better minor league facilities than the Brewers do right now. Starting from the Dominican up to Arizona, two of the best in those areas in all of baseball without any argument. Now you go to Carolina, the Mudcats, it's not very good. It's probably one of the worst in low A, but they're in the process of building a new $70 million stadium that the Brewers owners are mostly paying for because they own the Mudcats. So that's a $70 million expenditure right there. And it's going to give them really good facilities compared to the rest of the league. The Timber Rattlers were just voted like the best stadium in minor league baseball this past like a month ago. And they won the like minor league franchise of the year because of all the upgrades they made to the Timber Rattler Stadium. Biloxi's still a new stadium, really nice facility. Nashville is a gorgeous facility because they're trying to prove that they can handle an MLB team. So they have really, really good facilities too. It'd be hard for me. I think it'd be pretty hard to find a team that has better facilities for all of their prospects in baseball. And especially once that Mudcat Stadium gets built, I don't know how anyone would, because most of these stadiums are brand new or recently renovated, and a bunch of money's been put into it. And I think the organization they don't need to be praised for it or anything, but they should get more attention, and people should understand that that's a really big part of player development, really big part of making your team better in the future without having to break the bank on free agents. It goes a really long way. And it's another thing that the Rays do invest in. Like they don't invest in much, but they invest in this type of development. And that I didn't even count how many coaches they bring in for this. Like I think they said the Dominican Academy has like 12 coaches there. And then that doesn't include the educators and the chefs and all these people who are there just to help the team and the players grow. I just want to make sure it's not overlooked, because I think that people only view the payroll as like the entirety of what owners put into a baseball team. And there's a lot more. And there's a lot of teams who don't put this type of money into the player development portion of things. They just go out and they try and solve all their problems by signing free agents. And to me, if you want an example of that, that's what the Royals are doing this offseason. And a lot of people have pointed to how the Royals are spending all this money and it's great. And they're just covering up all these holes they've created over the years by signing a bunch of mediocre free agents. And yes, Gunnar, I'm calling Hunter Renfroe a mediocre free agent. I apologize in advance. But that's to me what it is. It's duct tape over a leak. And it's not really, the Brewers just seems more sustainable to me. The method of spending money on that type of stuff on player development seems a lot more sustainable. I just wanted to make sure they did get a little appreciation for that. And then the only other thing I had from that video is that Yoferi Rodriguez, who I had, I think when we went through my list, he was like 13th or 14th or something in the system. That dude is impressive. First of all, he already speaks like fluent English. He's 18. The way he talks, it's just very mature approach, understands that like he understands the big picture at a level that's really impressive. I don't have too much more to add on that, but it did make me even more high on him as a player, because I think guys who have that level of maturity, it's going to help them as they go forward. And I know Willy Adames has said that speaking English really helped him develop as a player because it just made him more comfortable. So he's kind of got both those things going for him, and that puts him in a pretty good spot as he heads into what I'm imagining is going to be low A next year. I don't think he's going to play in the Arizona Complex League. I think he'll skip it like Churio and Lara did.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, like you said, I watched it too. and that's why I didn't know it was on YouTube because that's how I watched it. But I think I kind of broke it up into sort of I kind of wanted to go into their shoes a little bit, and I thought about sort of like the small picture first. So like, what does that mean? And we kind of have this experience being college baseball players. Um, we by the end of it, for sure, we had facilities that we could just go to, and how much that meant just in your development alone as just a baseball player, but. Um, just having that access, how much it means. And I think Carlos being away of it, even that video, he even talked about how this was, I mean, I don't even know what year that was, probably when he was first was coming up, but he talked about his lack of facilities, what he had growing up. And I think that was with even with the Brewers system, maybe he talked about somebody else's, but he said maybe the second year got a little bit better, quote unquote. He said he got like a facility, but it wasn't even much of a facility that he got. But you think about all those guys back then that came through the system and either worked out, didn't work out. Think about other organizations, guys that worked out, didn't work out, but how the lack of facilities and they're still able to succeed. Um, think about how they can succeed when they actually get these great facilities. I think that's actually a pretty good point. And that's just on the player side of it. I think you mentioned obviously the schooling side of it, the mentor side of it. That's like the human aspect I was looking at too. I mean, that baseball is such a mental game too, and I think if you think too much about the game and you just kind of obviously the system is to create baseball players, that's not really you're not hiding that fact, but it feels a little bit more wholesome and better if it's just more of like we actually care about these people and we care about their success. I think you might have mentioned it, or I'm thinking about the video again, but they talked about like, yeah, we're trying to make good baseball players, but these guys could turn out to not be that great at baseball players, but they end up being coaches back home where they're from or in the system even. Um, and they just end up being good people based upon that schooling and that mentorship. But I think it just shows how much they care about people. And I don't know, obviously Jackson Churio had these sort of it was up and coming when he was coming through, so he didn't get all this great facility that they're talking about. But I think he recognizes maybe some of that stuff that's going on. And it just kind of makes me think about like, do you think that really he's going to sign an extension if those things aren't like up to par for him? Like if we say we treated them badly or something coming up and just kind of not used them, but just kind of, whatever, you're a baseball player, it's all you are, like do your work, whatever. Um, I think he kind of feels that side of it too, when he feels how much he's loved and cared about rather than just baseball. And I think it just makes it easier for you to sign guys like that. And now we have one of maybe the best players in baseball potentially on our team because that's how just from doing all that, that was the payoff. And as I mentioned, all the guys who can come up in the future that we have too. And I think that's just sort of the small picture stuff that I was looking at. But big picture, I think, and you mentioned this too, is this is how you win in the margins. Milwaukee isn't really viewed as this destination city, obviously. To us, we love it, but there's no secret to that. It's not really offensive. We've heard it our whole lives, our whole childhoods. They say it every single time on ESPN. They got to make a point. That's maybe more for the Bucks and stuff. But Brewers, even looking at what's once was called Miller Park, AmFam Field, having a facility like that where you can play every day. Um, Milwaukee doesn't even really matter at that point. The weather, nothing matters because you have a roof. Um, you mentioned Arizona. I mean, that facility is nuts how good it is, how much they put into that now. Um, I think all that stuff, that's that's even it's big picture, but maybe some of the Jackson stuff is big picture too. But I just think all of this little stuff, it makes people more want to sign with Milwaukee versus just all they think about is Milwaukee cold, small market. Now it's just like, no, we got these really good facilities. We care about you. Um, and yeah, I just think it goes a super long way in pretty much every single aspect of the system. You can sign free agents like Reese Hoskins. Um, let's say we don't have a good Arizona facility. It's the worst in the league. Let's say somehow we have an outdoor field or something. He doesn't want to play in the cold, even though he played in Philly. There's just so many aspects that go into this that have nothing to do with player payrolls, like you mentioned, nothing at all. So um, I just think it's just crazy how much this is how every level you can go down the system and it's just everything ends up paying off in the end. And I think that's just something that really can't go overlooked at this point.
No, that's a really, really good point. And even on the Churio um, subject, I think back to when he got called up to Carolina. right away. And obviously I was excited about it. And I sent it to you and you were like, oh, I love his swing. And so now I'm really excited about him. But at the time, I remember they asked, like, it was either Arnold or it was the Brewers, maybe Tom Flanagan, the director of all the minor league stuff. They asked him, like, why did you make this call now? Like, he's barely 18. He's already moving up to full season ball. He didn't play in Arizona. And he talked about saying, he was like, honestly, we would have put him there on opening day, but we wanted to make sure he was comfortable in America. He'd just gotten over to America. We wanted to make sure that he could, one, handle it, but also that he was comfortable, like being around people who spoke a lot more English and not having as many like players that he could talk to in Spanish, and being able to live on his own away from his parents more, like where he didn't have that as a fallback. Like from the beginning, they were trying to keep his best interests at play more than saying like, yeah, he could, if we put him here now, we could move him even quicker. Like they wanted to make sure that he could adjust and that he had time to do that stuff. And as much as people don't want to hear it all the time, like your point about what the Brewers do with it starts at the major league level. Like I know the Yelich deal probably doesn't look great at the moment, but when he signed that deal, it was considered team friendly. And it was seen by a lot of people as like, wow, he would have got more if he had gone on the open market, especially if he has like another season like he has been. He did that because he liked Milwaukee. He likes the area. He likes the team. He likes the franchise. He signed that deal because that was what he wanted to do. He wanted to be here. Braun was similar. Braun probably could have got more. I think the second one, he definitely could have got more. But he loved being here and he likes Milwaukee. And like, I think there's always been this idea, like you said, and it is more Bucks than Brewers because ESPN would have to talk about the Brewers for them to say anything about Milwaukee. But they'd have to talk about baseball for them to say anything about the Brewers. But if you look at it, like in baseball, that argument never made any sense to me. You don't have to live. Most people don't live in Milwaukee in the winter. They go to Arizona or California or whatever during the season. Summers in Milwaukee are gorgeous. Like that's one of the best summers you can be around is a Midwest summer because it's not 110 at that time. It's 85 to 90 and it's nice weather and there's a lake and there's Summerfest and all this stuff. Like all the players who come to Milwaukee are always like, yeah, I never really realized like it's great here and during the season. And then I don't have to worry about the snow because I don't live here during the season or during the off season. Like it's always been a weird thing to me that people cared about it. But like you said, they don't have to worry about weather at all when they come here to play. And I actually heard DL Hall say that in one of his interviews. He said they asked him specifically about the roof, and he was like, yeah, my first thought was like, man, I've never played in a place like Milwaukee where it's going to be cold. And then he was like, and then I found out they had a roof or a retractable roof. And he was like, oh, great. Now I don't have to worry about that at all. Like immediately it was like a huge positive for him to just not have to worry about the weather. Which by the way, before we get too, I'm going to talk about some other stuff here soon, but DL Hall, I don't want to say he's going to be Brandon Woodruff, the pitcher, but if you listen to him do an interview, tell me it's not like rookie and second year Brandon Woodruff doing interviews. It's like this shy Southern dude who's got like some dry humor to him, but just seems like a really, really nice guy. He's been a fun interview. He's not, like I said, he's not outgoing or anything, so it's not going to be like a bunch of jokes or anything. But he's an easy guy. He seems like he's going to be a really easy guy to root for, which is nice. But yeah, like even in his case, he was like, yeah, that roof is going to be huge. I think people really do value that type of facility and the way the organization treats you. And Eric Kratz was kind of talking about during that Eric Haas and Austin Nola portion where Pierzynski said something like, well, these guys thought they were coming in with a chance to compete. And Scott Braun said, yeah, well, Eric Kratz re-signed with the Brewers in 2019, expecting to be one of their main catchers. And then they brought in Yasmani Grandal and Kratz was just kind of like, yeah, he's like, I definitely was not expecting that, but it was basically like, yeah, they made a move that they thought made sense for them. And they treated me well and they got me to a place where they thought I'd be able to play with the Giants. And like, if you treat your players well, they remember it. And the issue is that the two players the Brewers have traded and Hader and Burnes have felt wronged by the organization because of arbitration stuff. So they might have some words that they might talk bad about them a little bit, but it's pretty hard to find any other players who have left and say anything bad about the Brewers for a long time, but especially in the latest Stearns and Arnold and Counsell and now Murphy era. Like the Brewers, are known for being an organization who treats their players well, who has like this really good family dynamic. And it starts at that Dominican Academy, and it starts with nice facilities and treating them well at that level. And it does pay off in other ways, like with the extension, like you're talking about. It means something. It's not just lip service. It's not just like, oh, fancy toys for the guy. Like, no, it means something to treat the people well. So yeah, that's a really good point. Do you have anything else you want to add on that?
No, just to end off, I think why I called it small pitcher is because, I mean, really step into Jackson Cherio's shoes. He has never put on a Brewers uniform before. Why would you want to lock yourself into a team that you've never played for before? Yeah, you played for the organization. Hint, that's why. But you can maybe argue money. Yeah, that makes sense. But this guy's number one prospect in baseball. He's going to make his money. Like, I'm not really concerned about that. Um, but why would somebody sign up for that? It's because of everything you've done, all the steps he's taken up to that point. That's why he signed with the Brewers, not because whatever reason. I just think that's definitely why. Why would you blindly sign up for that? It's because of the organization.
Right. Yeah. If he was uncomfortable and he hadn't enjoyed his time in the organization, the money would have not mattered because he's a confident guy. He knows he's going to make money, like you said. There's got to be a level of trust and love for the organization to want to take that step. There's a reason there aren't many extensions like this for guys who do things or before they ever make it to the majors. It is partially because the team has a bunch of risk, but it's also 100% because players don't know exactly what they're signing up for if they extend before they even see time in the major leagues and are around the guys up there. So no, that's a really good point. And like I said, if you haven't checked out that video, I would definitely watch it. It's not long, but it's cool to see. And hopefully it gives a glimpse into like how the Brewers do operate as a franchise. But yeah, just to wrap things up, then we had a couple other, I think I'm probably a podcast or two late on some of these, but the Brewers signed catcher slash first baseman Andy Yerzy to a minor league deal. He actually spent a little time in the American Association, which is the same independent ball league as the Milkmen last year. That's where he finished this season, but he has a lot of pop in his bat. He only played in 2 AAA games last year. He had 2 homers. Or he played in 5 AAA games last year. He hit 2 homers. One of them left the bat at 113 miles per hour and went 426 feet. Tall dude, big dude. Surprisingly has been a lot better behind the plate over the years than you would guess given his size. But you're also probably a little surprised that his arm isn't very good at his size. So he's probably more of a first baseman, but the power hasn't really showed up in stats as much as you might have expected it to. But if he can get to that power more often, the swing's pretty nice looking. I'll have to check out what Gunnar thinks of it later when I send it to him. And it's like I said, I mean, 113 mile per hour home run is a big deal for anybody. I mean, you have pop if you can hit a ball at that launch angle with that type of exit velocity. So he was a somewhat of a prospect back in the day for the Diamondbacks, 2nd round pick, but hasn't really worked out yet. Brewers are normally pretty good at finding these random like indie ball guys or guys like this and giving them a chance. So interested to see. I think he might start in AA, but could be AAA. Who knows? But yeah, he'll be one to watch for sure. And then they signed one that's kind of the exact opposite of what Yerzy is, and that's outfielder Chavez Young. Super good athlete. He has like just a cannon of an arm. He's had double-digit assists, outfield assists every single season of his career, except for 2022 when he only played 70 games and he threw out 9 that year. So just a really good arm. He had 15 assists in 102 games last year. He's a big-time stolen base threat too. Pretty fast guy. He's had at least 20 the last 5 seasons, and he had 32 last year between AA and AAA. The difference is obviously those things because Yerzy doesn't do any of those things, but also the way their approach and their abilities at the plate are a lot different too, because Young does not have much impact in the bat, but he makes like good swing decisions. He doesn't chase much, but he does whiff a decent amount in the zone, which I was a little surprised about. The bat's going to need to be able to make more of an impact for him to actually help the Brewers, but he kind of reminds me of like the outfield version of what Andrew Monasterio was when he got here. Just kind of solid at a lot of things, but needs to improve the bat a little bit. So never know. Maybe he finds it. But another interesting pickup, I'd imagine he'll be in AAA to start the year. And if you go back even just 2 years, the Fangraphs ranked him as the 38th prospect in the Blue Jays system. gave him a 45 hit tool, future hit tool, 45 future game power, 50 raw power, 55 speed, 50 field, and a 60 arm, which I would guess it might be even better than that given how many assists he gets. Um, he played for Great Britain in the World Baseball Classic, and he had 5 steals in that, which actually tied the record for one World Baseball Classic by any player. So he's going to be a fun player. I don't know that he's somebody that helps the major league team, especially since he's an outfielder and the Brewers are not lacking in outfield depth at the upper minors and in the majors, but um, solid depth to add to the system. And wouldn't surprise me to see him maybe be a guy that ends up getting traded after a decent year at AAA for like an interesting player. The Brewers have done that before. But nice depth, and definitely will probably make Nashville games fun to watch. And then we had one more invitee to spring training. We talked about a bunch of the prospects last time, but they invited non-roster right-handed pitcher Harold Chirino to spring. He got hurt in like mid-May last year. He was pitching in Double-A. I think he was actually on his way to Nashville, I want to say. But then they found that he was hurt before he could go to Nashville. He looked really, really good before he got hurt last year. Now, he was using that pre-tacked baseball, so the spin was probably up higher than it would normally have been, but the velocity had jumped even in spring training last year to mid to upper 90s, whereas it had been like 92 to 95. In the past, it was like 95 to 98 last year. And then he throws a really, really nice curve. That was always a really good pitch for him. It got probably better with the pre-tack ball, but he also throws a slider. I think he calls them two different curveballs, but it's more of a curveball and a slider. I don't see him. We already talked about the bullpen logjam. I don't see him making the roster out of spring, but as injuries happen, as players underperform throughout the season, like he's a name I'll be watching for sure if he can stay healthy himself, because the stuff's good. And he's a guy that I could absolutely see being on the roster at some point in 2024. And if not, I mean, he'll probably be the closer for Nashville for most of the season. So definitely one to watch. And then we got a couple top 100 updates from Kylie McDaniel, who's with ESPN. So his top 100, the Brewers had 6. They had Churio at number 2, Jefferson Caro at 32, Mizorowski at 46, Tyler Black at 51, Joey Ortiz at 91, and Brock Wilken slid in at 97. He also listed 3 other names that made like his list of guys that were in contention. So Luis Lara was 148 on his list. Luke Adams was 163, and Robert Gasser was 164. So Adams, I think he might be the highest on Adams right now, which is exciting because I'm a big Luke Adams fan. And then he also ranked the system 5th in MLB, which was a little lower than some of the other ones, but clearly he's still pretty high on it. I think he's just got a couple organizations that he views as a little closer to impacting or a little higher end. But then there's Keith Law, who is very, very high on the Brewer system. He's go through the Athletic. So Churio at number 2 again. I mean, he's second behind Holiday on everybody's list, which is fine. Jackson Holiday's very, very good. Now he's the high guy on Jefferson Caro because he's got him 12th in all of baseball. That might be even higher than I would have him, which I've always viewed myself as the high guy on Caro, but I think he might have him even higher than I would. Tyler Black at 44, so that's one of the highest rankings for him. Joey Ortiz at 58, which is one of the highest rankings for him. Brock Wilken at 71, which I'm certain is the highest ranking I've seen so far for him. And then Jakob Mizorowski at 90th, which is probably the lowest of anybody. The reasoning for that is that he just fully believes Mizorowski's not going to be able to start. The fact he even puts him on there while thinking he's going to be a reliever is pretty crazy because people don't rank relievers in the top 100. That's how good his stuff is, that even if he falls to the bullpen, he's probably going to be just ridiculous there. And then he ranked the farm system number 2 behind Baltimore as usual. So yeah, I mean, just another reminder of how good of a job the Brewers have been doing at building up this farm system while never taking a step back on the field at the major league level. It's pretty impressive. But yeah, that's all we got for kind of the odds and ends wrap up here. So Gunnar, why don't we finish it off? This is it's just, I can't keep saying it's a long episode. It's a normal episode. And I have talked so much. But Gunnar, your pick for your random Brewer, it looks like you're going to upset me.
Yeah. Well, first, no one's complained about the episode length yet, so we assume we're doing our due justice. But if you don't like the episode length, I guess you can yell at us for that. But yeah, I'll explain myself here in a second, but I do have to apologize for Spencer for picking this player. That is Jeff Jenkins. I This is not obviously an obscure brewer. That's why I didn't really want to pick him. But there was a tweet last night about I saw it pop up on my timeline. It was like kind of an exercise to pick one player from the last 26 years and kind of create a 26-man roster out of it with like your favorite team. So I picked Jeff Jenkins on that roster. But like ever since then, last night I haven't really been able to stop thinking about him. He was obviously an awesome player. I think he was a huge high school player too. Top 10 pick, and he was here for 10 years too. I think injuries and stuff caught up to him. So and the roster wise, I mean, that was a pretty young roster. Once he left 2007, I think was the last year he was here. So
Yep.
we were just kind of going in two different directions at that point, and it's kind of made sense. And he got himself a ring with the Phillies. So I remember kind of being excited to see him do that. I remember always kind of mocking his swing. He had the classic high leg kick, and I wasn't a lefty, so I thought it was funny trying to mock that swing all the time. But um, his big ankle injury, I remember that. That's a big one where he basically snapped his ankle in half, which really, I mean, even for back then, it wasn't that long ago, but that seems like that would be devastating for like anybody. And maybe baseball is different in that aspect. I don't think you could survive if that was like a basketball play back then or something, but still pretty crazy that he survived that as far as playing career. I don't think death was in the the picture for an ankle
This
injury,
isn't
but
like 1702, Gunner. It was
Um, but then yeah, I remember I can't find a photo of this thing, but I swear they called left field like Jenkins Jungle.
they did.
Yeah, and I can't find any like memory of that and anything, but I remember that being like in left field going to games sometimes, like I'm in Jenkins Jungle. This is awesome. He's my favorite player. And we always kind of joke between me and Spencer how he was like a Ryan Braun before Ryan Braun because Ryan
Yeah.
Braun meant everything to us. So um he was just my favorite player probably growing up. I don't know if I probably said that about a couple of guys, but um, he definitely was. That's like in cement before 2000. Braun came in 2007. So yeah, I mean,
Oh
no,
wait. It was oh 08 when well, it was oh 07 when Braun came, but oh 08 is when it changed from
yeah,
Jenkins to
yeah,
Braun.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. So yeah, um, yeah, that's all I got, I guess. So
Yeah.
Spencer, who do you got?
Well, I gotta give my Jeff Jenkins love now because you took it. I didn't know if we were calling him random enough for me to use him for this. So,
That's what
um,
I clarified.
no, he that ankle injury. So I don't know. I was probably what 5 at that time when that happened, but I cried like the entire night after seeing it happen. I just kept crying. My parents were not happy about that. I just could not stop crying. It made me so sad. I thought my favorite player's career was over. I was never going to see him again. Turns out it was a broken ankle, a bad one, but he was going to be able to play baseball again. Um, and then, yeah, I used to dress up like Jeff Jenkins probably every year for Halloween for like a good 3 year stretch there. And then I also wore his outfit just around the house quite a bit, wore cowboy boots as my cleats. Don't know why that made sense to me, but that's what I did. Um, but yeah, he was definitely my guy before Braun. And it's always cool when he comes back around the team, like just seeing him still involved in the Brewers. Like I talked about, just guys who want to be involved with the Brewers still. It's really cool to see. Mine is 100% the exact opposite direction of Jeff Jenkins. I went with Nevin Ashley. He spent, I want to say, a week and a half with the Brewers in 2015. He he was like a career minor leaguer. I remember the story when he came up. Like it was a really cool story. A guy who had grinded for over a decade in the minors. He was like 30 or 31 when he made his debut. Just a catcher, a longtime catcher in the minors. But he had a double against the Marlins in his first game, I remember. And then another fun fact about him is that his wife's name was Ashley. So her name was Ashley Ashley. And so they talked about that a lot whenever he'd come up. I think he probably had maybe one more hit in his 20 at bats or something that he had, but first hit was a double. It was a cool moment for sure. One of those things that makes like a long bad season like 2015 was kind of worth it to see those types of moments. Um, so yeah, I always wonder what kind of happened to him, but I always remember him also because of his wife's name being Ashley, which is that's tough, man. That's really tough. Um, but yeah, no, that's mine. And yeah, I don't know, Gunnar, you got any cool Nevin Ashley memories that you want to share?
I have negative memories actually.
All right. We'll wrap it up then. So for those of you listening still, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you are on. Remember to follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod. And please feel free to leave feedback for us on how we can get better. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.
See ya.